we've been here before. This isn't unprecedented. We have had pandemics that coincide with lynchings, that coincide with war. And so I say that to say, again, what makes this uniquely a Black American experience, and Raphael did point that out, right, is that white supremacy in this country thrives off of racism. And every group that was at one point not considered white has bared the wrath of white supremacy and oppression.
At Clio, our mission is to transform the practice of law for good, and increasing access to justice is a major component of that. Clio fundamentally believes in equity and justice as critical pillars of the legal and judicial system, and we are committed to using our platform to advocate for change. In light of recent events, we're conducting a series of interviews to address the systemic racism that is pervasive in our society. We need to be talking about these topics in the legal industry so that we may create a more equitable and accessible justice system. We hope these conversations can play some part in moving things forward. Today's guest is Andrea Alexander, an attorney based in New York City who defines herself as a legal advocate by day and a social change advocate by night. Andrea, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So Andrea, you're in New York City during an extremely turbulent time, first with the COVID-19 outbreak, where you've obviously been at the epicenter of the outbreak in America, and now with the protests over the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and others who've lost their lives due to systemic injustice. What have the past few weeks and months been like for you?
So I'm going to throw another thing on top of the things you just mentioned. I had a baby 6 months ago. And so
Wow. So just to layer on top of that as a backdrop, you've got a new baby, a new human being in this world.
A new human being that's also male, yes. So I came back, and actually my first day was the beginning of the work from home orders. And so what had been maternity leave extended further. And I must admit, as daunting as that sounds for a lot of people, he's been the silver lining in all of this, and having an opportunity to spend more time with him. I think a conversation for another day is the U.S.'s family planning and lack of leave time, adequate leave time for families to nurture newborns. But again, conversation for another day. So we got, I started back and figuring out navigating working from home and taking care of him. And then a few weeks ago, the trickle in, and I also want to say I've kind of taken a step back from cable news about 4 years ago, decided that I just could not, in order to function and not feel traumatized and re-traumatized daily, took a step back. So I've had you have to have a healthy relationship throughout all these last 3 months. Fortunately, as I said, I'm Brooklyn born and raised. There are few of us here, but fortunately I have family and friends and good mental hygiene, staying in touch with folks. So that was rather seamless, and then navigating work was a lot. With the protests, it's been interesting in response to the injustices that we're seeing, in response to the murders. And that part, and I'm sure, I've listened to conversations you had with Raphael, and I'm sure many of the conversations you're having with family and friends. Sadly, you almost go numb as a Black person in America when you hear yet another murder, whether it's a vigilante citizen or the police. And in fact, all murder, right, is painful when you hear. It's certainly the issues and the instances that we're currently seeing seem rather brutal. And I don't know, there's just something primitive about, whether it's kneeling on someone's neck or hunting someone down in the streets. And so I think visually, yes, I think that has been something that's a bit hard, almost like Michael Brown, watching him lay in the street for hours. So it's been a lot, having to nurse a child, nurse a Black boy, log on to work and be professional while trying to remain hopeful, but also incredibly frustrated and incredibly tired.
I can only imagine the stress at so many different levels that must create for you. And as you mentioned, a poignant image of all of this going on around you while you're nursing a newborn son. When you frame your roles both as a legal advocate and a social change advocate, can you tell us more about what that means to you?
So I think, when I graduated law school, I had ideas about what I wanted to do. And unfortunately, I went to school in 2007, so the height of the financial crisis. You had to readjust immediately. And what I thought I wanted to go into, along with the realization of student loan debt, kind of changed the trajectory for me. And what I found was, and I've worked in both the private and public sector for government and corporate and corporations, you find that you have to find a happy medium, right? So like your job may not give you all the satisfactions that you want. And so off hours, after work, finding that meaningful work. And so I've done that separately, participating in political action groups like Common Cause, assisting with campaigns, fundraising, doing that work as a volunteer. And during the day, I do think that there are ways of continuing the fight for equity by just being my authentic self as much as you can in a professional setting, right? That's a challenge for anybody, much less as a Black woman in a corporate setting. And so it is something that I think earlier on in my career, I made a commitment to do and to be as authentic as I can, because we spend far too many hours at work to be drained being someone else. And fortunately, I've worked in places in which I think I've been able to do that and accomplish that.
And can you tell us a little bit more what that means for you? It's a concept we hear a lot about, but it'd be great to hear what that means on a kind of real basis for you.
I mean, for me, I think it is always standing up when I see injustice. And look, you can have the most intentional work environment of conscious thinkers who are well-meaning in their efforts, who slip up. And in the workplace, we are taught to sort of that fine line of not bringing politics into it, not bringing race, not bringing class, not bringing your personal life into work, even though, the hours we spend together, and it's a hard effort. I've always been someone, when I've heard something, spoken up. Sometimes it's on my way out, where I've used that as an opportunity to speak to HR or speak to senior management to tell them exactly why I decided to leave. I've had a few instances in which, unfortunately, it was due to lack of equity and lack of accountability. And upon my exit, learning that things had improved for the folks that remained. And it's unfortunate that I had to leave jobs for that reason. But encouraging to know change took place in my absence because I spoke up, because other people left before me who didn't, right? And it could also be as simply as wearing my hair naturally. I've never processed it for an interview. This is who I am, and I rather not be hired because of one's prejudices, if this is too much for you, than to take a job and then have to be somebody else when I arrive. And I know, sometimes I think about it because it's not anything I've tried to do. It is just what I've done. I've had people where I've gone to legal conferences or I've gone to work and have been asked, you go to interviews with natural hair? Wow, I've not even something I'd considered. I would be too afraid to do it. And so I think that sometimes we do underestimate the small actions that we take that in fact can be revolutionary for someone else, can be an act of protest. And it's so necessary in quote professional settings to be who you are, as again, we spend so much time in these spaces that it's exhausting. And I think we're also seeing that. I'm hearing that a lot with friends in their various employment situations, that they're tired of walking that line and doing everything they think they need to do right and still feeling like you're not getting ahead, or still watching, that mediocre white male get the promotion.
Right.
So I definitely think, even if you're not on the front lines, there are many ways of protesting, and I try to bring that into the workplace as well. And I think it's important, and hopefully more people feel safe in doing that.
So when we look at the macro environment around us, Andrea, and there's no question we're at a unprecedented time in history, and you look at the confluence of events with the public health and economic crisis, this massive movement for social justice, and a rapidly evolving legal industry that's responding to this. Even at the court level, we're seeing processes evolve at an unbelievable rate. One of the things we've been talking through in this week's interviews, and you mentioned you listened to Raphael's incredible interview from earlier this week, we're talking about the systemic nature of racism and inequity. We're talking about ways that we can examine really everything from public health to law enforcement, the legal system, the judicial system, and how all of those systems are interconnected. Can you speak to that and the interrelationship between those various institutions and where systemic racism lives in each?
How much time do we have?
I know that's a big question. We've got as much time as you need.
Look, I think and I don't want to minimize the fact that this is an interesting time for those of us living it. But what I caution as a society in thinking about, yes, a pandemic and the unearthing for some people of injustice in this country, and for others, hope that things will truly change. We've been here before. This isn't unprecedented. We have had pandemics that coincide with lynchings, that coincide with war. And so I say that to say, again, what makes this uniquely a Black American experience, and Raphael did point that out, right, is that white supremacy in this country thrives off of racism. And every group that was at one point not considered white has bared the wrath of white supremacy and oppression. This is uniquely a Black moment in thinking about how the traumas of it all affects us, is that it's 401 years of that. And so hopefully in delving into this, and hopefully in thinking about the institutions that have codified hate and racism in our country, we will then improve the situations of others who are still oppressed that are not a part of the current conversation, right? So Native Americans, Asian and Latino Americans, poor Americans. Our institutions are filled with people. And I believe, we talk about this idea, and we're hearing a lot more about it in how do we reprogram the human mind, because racism is, even if people don't want to call it that, right, the othering of us as people in this country is fundamental. It is what this country was founded upon. And so one won't happen without the other. You can't bifurcate this process. We can't sort of ignore the human impact and the human desire and the human training to see skin as a hall pass or not, and then effectuate change in the legal field. Or as we see with the pandemic, the healthcare system and access and education. And so, it's a frustrating thing. It's like the chicken or the egg, because one can't happen without the other, but which one do we start with? Or is there a first or second, or are these things happening simultaneously? I also caution against seeing this as unprecedented times, because I think it gives a pass to our leadership to fold and to say, we've never seen anything like this before. We are in uncharted waters. We don't know how to even respond. No, we've seen this before, and we have responded before. And let's not forget, 2 weeks ago, we had folks marching to state capitals armed, and the next day, states deciding to open up, right? So we've seen this before, and we've seen whose voices are valued and our leadership cave and fold in the face of a pandemic. Nowhere else in the world would that have happened. I've traveled all over, and some countries don't even allow you to bring a camera to a state house, much less be armed. And yet in this country, it's tolerated. And so we've got a lot of fundamental flaws, but we see it working for half and not the other. So the answers are in how it's working for the other half. How do we then share? We talk to children about sharing, and for some reason, we can't figure that part out.
And I'm curious, you mentioned that framing this as unprecedented is maybe dangerous in some ways. Does it feel different to you? Does it feel like there's a different energy or different momentum around what we're seeing over the last 2 weeks? Or does it feel like if we're pessimistic, I guess, just a repeat of the same pattern of some temporary outrage and then a return to normal?
Yeah. In my short time on Earth, considering how long this has been going on, I want to be so optimistic. Does it bring me joy to see communities that do not have visible diversity marching in the streets for people that, for all intents and purposes, are abstract? Absolutely. You have not seen that before. Around the world, my parents are from a small island in the Caribbean, and there's conversation there about what's happening in the United States. I think there's a global reckoning, with colonization and the effects of it, and that 400 years of the American story is still happening, and people are wanting to have that. I am cautious in relying solely on images of kumbaya, and I'm happy to see all folks of different ethnic backgrounds, of different socioeconomic backgrounds marching in the streets, absolutely. But, sort of like the Obama transcending race, I feel like we rush to this other side, we're like, we're there, we're getting there. There's this interwoven lacing and hands and love, and that is a beautiful thing. Duh. We know we're capable of that. And we've been there before. So how do we get across? How do we get the people who, for whatever reason, are hook, line, and sinker going to follow the current administration to whatever road they're trying to lead this country down? And the reality is there's still a substantial percentage of this country that believes in whatever that mission is. I mean, I don't know what it is, but it's, anything other than, to me, racist ideology. And so when I think about that, when I know there are communities here in my city that are closed off, insular, insulated, not interested in talking about, thinking about diversity, not willing to engage. And this is here in New York. I know there are parts of this country. I mean, I went to law school in the South. And some of the things I'm seeing up north, to some extent, are more extreme than anything I would have seen down there. And so in those moments, I worry. In those moments, I don't allow hope to overshadow reality.
Let's maybe move our focus to the legal industry in particular. And if we're going to dismantle systemic racism, there's obviously a big role that the legal industry and the broader justice system have to play in that. What are some of the ways that you feel law firms and legal organizations need to change?
I still think, and maybe there's some sensationalization of it through television shows, but Mad Men culture, the fact that folks gravitated towards shows like that, and this idea of these corporate, money hungry boys club settings, I think the same thing as far as reprogramming the norm. I think there's still a lot of work to be done there to create work environments. And I think this generation, those of us who want to live a life of fulfillment, whether it's professional, or going to work, getting your job done and going home, but being able to find some fulfillment in going to work every day, is to see that change. It's to see a corporate culture that values all people. I think that's going to take, whether it's firms, whether it's in-house, whether it's government, transparency. I think people want to know that I'm being fairly compensated, that I have access to the same goalposts as my colleagues when it comes to promotions, that there is some metrics that is based on fairness, and that, you're not, and so that's the professional side of it, of the legal field, where I think those are some changes as far as staffing, as far as attracting talent, right? A diverse talent. And then moving forward, using, as I said, I mean, we know this because our institutions reflect this, is we have hate and racism codified in this country. And so there is so much room for the legal system to effectuate change when it comes to rethinking that. And our legislators, I mean, you know, many of whom are lawyers or were lawyers, practicing practitioners. So hopefully I answered your question. I think there's a lot of room. And I think that we're going to be, you know, nothing happens without having some lawyers in the room when it comes to changing law, right?
And you did answer the question. I'd love to maybe get, you know, more specific when you look at, you know, lawyers as individuals, maybe, and like you said, everywhere from a solo attorney practicing in a small town up to the legislators that are creating the laws that we're all held to, are influencing this system. What are some of the ways that you think the individuals that are acting in this system can do, you know, more maybe to educate themselves about the issues and change the frame that they're using to look at the world?
This is a tough time, right? Because we're asking folks, many of whom may not even believe that they benefit from the privilege of whiteness. If we're going to talk about in the context of race in this country and how it affects our legal system. And those same people are then given the tools and discretion to essentially, if you're a prosecutor, the types of, you know, exposure that you'll have the defendant to based on your own prejudices. And so I think right now what we're finding is everyone's yearning, and I'll be, you know, regular and just say, look, people are thirsty for knowledge right now, especially when it comes to their own ignorances. And so I think there's a lot of books there on that. And I don't even need to say them because I think they're all online now and people are like talking about what books on racism. I also think we need to rethink history, our history lessons, because at the end of the day, we have spent a significant amount of time erasing so many people from the story of America, and the American legal system has not helped in that. And so what we've seen cases where judges are exercising broad discretion. If a kid comes from a great family, you know, they're getting a different penalty than a kid that is deemed worthless and or a lifelong criminal. You know, it is the discretion that we are afforded is necessary, I guess, but we have to start to come to terms with the fact that these are still people given the power to exercise such discretion. And so there's, you know, it's going to take more than the unconscious bias conversation at the office or the, you know, workshop. It's going to take a reprogramming and people who believe that it's worth doing. And you know, look, if you don't believe it's worth doing, at least having law firms and companies and corporations standing behind doing the work.
And what does that deeper work look like to you? When we look at the kind of conversations that need to be happening, the kind of change that need to be happening, I do think there's a problem of the window dressing type courses that we see, the workshops, the online courses you take for half an hour and get some checkbox that obviously are not going to be the catalysts of real change. What's it look like to go deeper and actually have conversations or have education at law firm levels that will drive some of the shift we need to see?
You know, that's a tough one because, you know, I truly do believe to some extent that, you know, a part of it's going to be the individual will to see change, right? What are individuals doing when they go home? What are they talking to their children about? What are they talking to their families about? Because it's not going to happen in isolation. You're not going to turn off your diversity radar, you know, when you leave the office. It's something I think, especially as Black people, it's something we carry and walk around with every day. So I do think what companies need to do is to continue the conversation. It cannot end when a quota is met. It cannot end when the number of senior leadership is at a desired amount, and then that representation gives comfort. I think we'll see it when we both see the physical and the visual presence of other people outside of the traditional norm. And it'll be more, you know, it'll be bringing in, if you're going to have workshops, the right people. It's going to, you know, a lot of companies are going to start thinking about and talking about allyship, right? So we've talked about diversity, but we've never really encouraged the other or the dominant group from being a part of the conversation, or requiring them to be a part of the conversation to tackle, you know, the biases that they're bringing in, the biases that we, you know, carry with us. And so hopefully it is something that companies are then pushing their white employees to really wake up and think about, so that the burden isn't bared, you know, we don't bear it just on the people of color who are doing the education, but that companies are truly being revolutionary in the type of workshops and trainings that they have, that they're not these, you know, boilerplate checkbox. I went to a diversity talk, I learned about unconscious bias, you know, we all have it, and make people feel like, you know, I guess it's
problem
the
solved.
niceties, right? Problem solved, and you're not the problem, and we all have this, but truly are digging deep and saying, no, while we may all have prejudices, some prejudices get other people killed. Some prejudices keep people from getting promotions. Some prejudices affect people's livelihood. And those are the ones we really, you know, that's what we really need to talk about. It is not pretty, but if we can truly get there, I think we're going to get the best you're going to get the best out of your staff, out of your teams, and out of your company. I mean, diversity is now going to be looked at, and young people are going to want to know, you know, it's more than the hashtag, it's more than the black screen, and it's more than Black Lives Matter, we believe in you. We may not all agree on what that looks like, and obviously I'm having a hard time even trying to fathom what all that would entail, but I think it's going to be a feeling, and it's going to be something people are going to know, okay, that company is living up to it's living up to beyond, you know, more than just a hashtag.
Right. And there's a concept you touched on briefly I'd like to dig in a little bit more on, which is just this idea of going beyond diversity, where diversity can just be the window dressing. And we talk about concepts like inclusion and allyship. What does that mean to you? Can you explore that for a moment?
Tough stuff, Jack. Thank you. I think allyship is truly I mean, we've seen this both when we have for women in the workplace and looking to male colleagues to truly understand. I think most companies haven't fully gotten us there either. When we talk about equity, gender equity, pay equity based on gender, based on race, allyship, I think, is going to be the times in which I've passed an office and I've heard a joke and I've watched a room full of colleagues not say anything, right? And one day, true allyship will be someone calling that out, someone saying, whatever the joke is, whatever the statement is, whatever the assumption is based on ignorance, and not bearing retribution for doing so. And so that's where the company comes in, right? Where there is no retaliation for people speaking up. And that employees realize that their company, it's more than just the hashtag, it's more than just the diversity training or this is a company will support folks who are doing the right thing, right? Like a Good Samaritan law, making sure that you're showing up and that the work doesn't rest on the shoulders of the marginalized group. We're tired. And I think today what we're seeing, and at least the recognition, and I know from white friends in my life, is an understanding and that this isn't for you. This is no longer just the burden for you. We have to do the work. We have to speak up.
Yeah. And you talked also about the concept of reprogramming and just reevaluating the building blocks that we're looking at in the system and the tools and training we're giving new lawyers. Can we talk about law schools for a moment, and maybe through your own experience and in working with colleagues over the course of your career, how can law schools and what we're doing in law schools be reevaluated in this context? Can we be doing more to educate newly minted lawyers about the social justice issues that can be tackled, and maybe about the kind of systemic racism we do see in the system and how they can start to counter that and change it.
Yeah, I think, to your earlier point, as we talked about COVID, and one of the things we are going to have to, there's a reckoning, I think, for higher educational institutions, right? We've got folks who are homeschooling, and they're going to have to rethink the cost of education. Are people, funding potentially, how that'll affect scholarships, how that'll affect the populace, like the students that are going to be able to afford to go and who will continue. So I think there's going to be a lot there following COVID to really think about how higher education is going to justify, one, the cost, especially when maybe there isn't a job at the other end of the 4 years or 3 years in the case of law school. I can give you an example of something that, and one, sort of like the professional space of thinking about it, and as fundamental as it is. I remember the first few weeks of law school, going to class, before you're really talking, before, who some of the hand raisers are off the bat, but you don't really know anyone. And rather quickly, you start to hear conversations about study groups. And you realize, well, shoot, no one's asked me to join their study group. How does this work? You ask around, you start to get to know people, and, oh, John asked me to join the study group, and Sarah asked me to join her study group, and you look around, and what's left, who's left? And that tells you a part of the story, right? It doesn't end even in this professional setting, and that then goes on to work, right? Those people, that mentality, not even recognizing there's anything like a fatal flaw in that, right?
Right.
In that you are alienating before I haven't been able to, none of these people have proven their intelligence, but off the bat, we're not invited to the table. We're not a part of those study groups. And then flash forward, the months go by, you start to get to know people. Folks then tell you, oh, I wish I had added you to my study group. Why are all the Black kids in the same study group? And it's an unfortunate, exhausting, never-ending story. You don't get to higher education and then the corporate setting as a Black person in America and not having had a story like that. And so, can it be left to professors to change that? Again, it is something where we're going to have to reprogram ourselves and again, call it out, whether it's the actual students who are setting it up. These are adults, or professors, or the institution that encourages diverse study groups, calls out the fact that in the past we've had these unfortunate traditional ways of identifying folks you want to study with who, for whatever reason, we know, you feel intellectually are on your level, and another group of people you don't think are intellectually on your level. I think there's going to have to be a lot of calling out, and it may not be nice and it won't feel great, but neither is being on the receiving end of being ignored.
And I'm curious, on a personal level, on the other side of law school, you've alluded to this a couple of junctures of our conversation around experiencing firsthand, maybe experiences that even cause you to leave jobs. Can you tell us what you've experienced on that front?
Equity is a huge thing. Today we were talking about it a lot, right? I think there's the idea of equality and then equity. And I've had situations in which you've observed, because this country, we don't really talk about salaries. You don't really know what other people make. It's the lack of transparency. It's hard to hold accountable a company. There are many times, many lawsuits about, people of color not being compensated fairly. It's a really hard thing to prove under the cloud of secrecy. And so oftentimes it is either in someone's exit in having an honest discussion about compensation that you realize, oh, wow, I am grossly underpaid. Or the workload that this person received through, some of the things I've heard friends talk to me about, or, when there's a lot of water cooler conversation, whether it's around sports or some other conversation that you're not necessarily a part of, and the person then says, oh, that guy's a great guy. She's great. She's super smart, maybe one interaction, but just enough to give you credit. I think I've come across scenarios in which that has been the case, where it's hard to break in socially, because there's such perceived differences, and people just not wanting to get to know me, or not wanting to get to know their Black or brown colleague. And I can't speak to all of the reasons why that exists. I think many of which we're seeing kind of materialize and come up in more conversations, and people are writing about. But I think in the workplace, that's something that a lot of people are really starting to think about. And we know this because we know that women are unfairly compensated. We know that there is a compensation issue, but that's just one, a lack of transparency in that space. And so hopefully, again, I've answered your question there.
Absolutely. And Andrea, there's always so much we could talk about on this set of topics. Before we wrap up today, is there anything we haven't delved into that you'd like to spend some time exploring?
There's probably a ton, and I know I took some. I thought about this because I wanted it to be meaningful, but I do want to say I think it's noble of you and other people who are interested in hearing from everyday people. I think right now, I'm not on Twitter. I don't remember my Facebook account information, and I only go on Instagram when I'm on vacation. So, if you're not online, diarrhea of the mouth, talking about issues, commenting, it's hard to be heard, it's hard to be seen. And so much of the conversation outside of even Brianna, when we think about this, is oftentimes when we think about the Black body, the Black experience in trauma, and rightfully so for many reasons, we think of Black male. And so I will say that I appreciate you guys being open to chatting with me, as a Black woman who I think many of us feel oftentimes are just ignored. And I think that also is something that, in thinking about race and thinking about the inequities and thinking about the violence, that there is a silent killer in feeling like you are not even a part of a society, and feeling like your voice isn't being heard, because no one wants to listen to it. And so, unless I guess it's on a TV show or music or something, pop culture driven. So I do think that is, I just wanted to say thank you for that, because I think there are a lot of voices like mine out there who, you kind of feel like, a lot of people probably think the things that I think, I don't really need to go write about it. I don't need to advertise it. But I think a lot of people have a lot to say, and I'm hoping that folks start to listen to their colleagues and are listening to their friends, and, more than just reaching out, but really listening. I think that's going to be very important right now.
Well, thank you in turn for sharing your voice with us today, Andrea. I appreciate it. And as a parting question, would love your reflection on what a more just and equitable system would look like to you.
If something like that even existed or could exist, I would argue that there's a population of people who've experienced that. And so I don't think we need to go very far to see how that works for some. What we need to do is apply it to the others. And I don't think any more reading, I don't think any more chatting or talking about it necessarily will bring us there faster. I think it can happen because we're acknowledging that there's inequity, and there's inequity for a portion of the population. And so let's go look at the other people who seem to be mostly happy. Look at people who are not used to hearing no, where they can go, what they can't do, how they should protest, how they should grieve, how they should feel, and afford those same privileges to those of us who've never been given the flexibility and the latitude to grieve, to protest the way we want, to be free in this country. And I'd like to, I think again, it's almost to the same level of saying this is unprecedented times, and not giving a pass to our leadership and saying, well, we don't know how to deal with it. Well, no, we do, because there's some real happy people in this country. There are people who don't have to one day educate their sons on what to say to not only a police officer, but good God, citizens who are now demanding that you tell them where you're going, what you're doing, and why you belong. You know, I don't think we need to go far to imagine what that kind of equity would look like, because it exists. I just think we need to now fairly apply it across the board to all Americans. And globally, obviously, all people.
And it does feel like, if nothing else, maybe it's an unprecedented opportunity for all of us right now.
Absolutely. And I think you said this on one of your other shows, and being that this is about technology, right? It is the fact that we are capturing this, we are videoing this, we are seeing this sometimes in real time
Right.
or shortly thereafter. And I think, to your point, right, those are things that are unprecedented, where in the past we can just say we don't believe, and now there is a visual aid to say, well, this is real, so how do you explain this one away? And it is
right.
unfortunate that we need that, but yes.
Well, thanks so much again for the wonderful conversation today and the perspectives you offered, Andrea. I really appreciate it. Keep up the amazing work, and you and your newborn son stay safe.
Thank you so much, and same to you.
Thanks for joining us on Daily Matters today, a podcast from Clio. Rate and review wherever you get your podcasts, and subscribe so that you never miss an episode. Daily Matters is produced by Andrew Booth, Sam Rosenthal, and Derek Bolin, and hosted by yours truly, Jack Newton. Thanks also to Clio, the world's leading cloud-based legal technology provider, for supporting this podcast. If you'd like to learn more about Clio, please visit clio.com.